Hey, it's Nancy. Before we begin today, I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Crime Beat early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. In the spring of 2006, a disturbing rumor was spreading on inner-city streets of Calgary, alleging that a woman had been confined, tortured, and murdered in a rooming house notoriously known as the White House. When officers arrived at the location known for its illicit activity, the landlord consented to them taking a look around. They found no signs of foul play. But as the days went by, two officers who regularly patrolled the area instinctively felt they needed to dig deeper. Further tips came in, and over the course of 6 days, they spoke with numerous witnesses and uncovered graphic details of agonizing abuse and violence. They seized a dumpster outside of the White House and found disturbing items that became their first solid evidence to corroborate the tips that had been received. They couldn't help but wonder if further evidence, including the body of a victim, might have been thrown into the dumpster a week earlier. And now, the two tenacious investigators were proposing that dozens of officers be taken away from their normal duties to sift through hundreds of tons of garbage in a landfill.
I think it would have been easy for us to say we did our best and walk away.
There was just too much information there to not investigate, and it needed an answer either way.
I'm Nancy Hixt, a senior crime reporter for Global News. Today on Crime Beat, I share the extreme measures police took to separate fact from fiction. This is the conclusion of Deadly Rumours. On a cold and particularly windy day in May of 2006, a haggard-looking man in his 30s was bundled up inside of his beat-up four-door sedan, wearing a thick hoodie to stay warm. The street he was parked on was known for illicit activity that included drug dealing, drug use, and sex work. His fingers were yellowed from nicotine stains, and there was dirt under his nails. His clothes were grubby, marked by spilled food and drinks. His long, stringy, unkempt hair was partially covered by a ratty-looking hat that he wore backwards. The man easily blended into his surroundings, and it would have been difficult to pick him out of countless others coming and going from the White House across the street. Nobody noticed that he stayed for hours watching. Every now and then, he casually rolled down his window and smoked a cigarette. His focus was on an upstairs window in the southwest corner of the house. He noted that there was no furniture in that room. He watched as the people inside painted the room and the windowsill. At that point, the man pulled out a cell phone and made a call. He was an undercover officer, and on the other line was his police supervisor. Calgary Police Superintendent Cliff O'Brien said, given what the officer saw, there was a concern that evidence was being covered up.
And so we were able to get a hold of the Crown Prosecutor's Office, tell them what we have, notwithstanding that we don't yet have a body, we don't yet even know the name of a potential victim, but this is what we're seeing, and it was very circumstantial at the time. And the Crown agreed that we could go in and stop the destruction of evidence, and then subsequent to that, apply for a search warrant.
The apartment was sealed off as a possible crime scene, as police waited for a warrant. In the meantime, there was a strategy session happening within the Major Crimes Unit at Calgary Police Headquarters. Days earlier, the homicide unit had declined taking on the case. But now, given the signs of a cleanup in the apartment and the evidence found in the dumpster, there was enough to support, at minimum, an aggravated assault. But was it enough to point to a murder? Or enough to warrant the time and resources required to dig up a portion of a dump the size of a football field?
I was involved in some of those early conversations, and I was very skeptical. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that we would find a body. There's not even a guarantee that a body is in there, that we have a victim in there. But if we don't search, we don't know.
The homicide unit agreed to take the case. They also took on the two officers, Constable Lee Dunbar and his partner.
At the time, Constable Hapner and myself were both seconded up to homicide to continue on, and got an incredible opportunity to work with some great homicide detectives on this for the remainder of the file.
12 days after the initial report of a possible crime, police began searching the dump. Somewhere buried under 500 metric tons of garbage, police believe they'll find a young woman's body.
At this time, we don't know who this person is. We have an estimate age range of the late teens to early 20s.
This homicide investigation actually began at the beginning of May. That's when police first got a strange tip that an unknown female may have been murdered.
As a result of the efforts of the investigators, they retrieved additional evidence which would suggest that the original information was accurate and credible.
Dunbar said the search was daunting, slow, and tedious.
I went to the dump regularly, and it was absolutely incredibly filthy, disgusting way to spend your days in the hot heat of summer. This is a medical waste area as well. Is one of the reasons we couldn't bring a cadaver dog in there. The smell today is, when you go by the dump, it brings back memories.
At the same time, Superintendent O'Brien said there were a number of other investigative strategies going on.
Sometimes in some investigation, you go from A to B to C to D, and other times you are all over the place because there's lots of things happening at the same time.
With the search for a body still underway, police work to identify a possible victim.
It is very difficult to investigate a potential homicide when you don't have a victim. You don't have any physical evidence, and in fact, you don't even know who the possible victim is. As the investigators are talking to the witnesses, they're hearing a couple different names and some descriptions. They heard a name of Rachel, possible Rachel. They heard another name of Rochelle, perhaps. But there's all these names going around, and not just names of the victim, but also names of the possible offenders. And so nobody comes forward and says, here's the driver's license of the person that we think is a suspect or the victim.
Officers scoured missing persons reports for anyone with one of those names. They also appealed to the public for tips through the media. Investigators say they're very sensitive to the fact news of the search could have some parents of missing girls on edge as they wait for more information.
What concerns me is the parents of either runaway children or young adults that may be concerned that this may be related to them.
One witness told police they heard the victim was a young sex worker named Rochelle, who walked with a limp. Outreach workers at city agencies didn't have anyone named Rochelle in their database.
Investigators did a great job. They were talking to investigators in British Columbia, obviously throughout Alberta, in other provinces as well, to track down with the very, very little piece of information they had, pieces of information they had around who the victim might be, to try to track that down. That's key for us. If we can identify who the victim is, then we can find out, is the victim still alive? Did they get assaulted? Or are they in fact deceased?
Then, a police crime analyst tracked down a promising lead. There was a woman matching that description named Rochelle, who was a reported victim of a beating. Dunbar and his partner managed to track down her relatives and later Rochelle herself, who was found still alive and well. She told officers she was off the streets in rehab and recovering from surgery to correct her severe limp. It seemed every lead on a possible victim came up short. At the same time, police were also working to identify 2 of the 3 suspects in the case. As you'll recall, Alexis Vandenberg was identified by piecing together ripped-up photos from the dumpster, and police verified she lived at the White House, in the apartment where the incident was alleged to have happened. Nearly 1 month after the initial report of a violent crime was made to police on May 23, 2006, police finally got a warrant. The Forensic Crime Scenes Unit was allowed in to photograph and examine room number 19, located on the 2nd floor of the White House in the southwest corner. That's when forensic investigators uncovered evidence the patrol officers who originally responded back on May 4th weren't able to see.
We have some signs of cover-up. We have some signs that the people in the building had tried to clean up the walls and paint the walls. We have signs of some blood stains in the carpet through luminol.
Also during that search, investigators identified a second possible suspect.
When we go and talk to the landlord is able to confirm the identity of Sarah, and that's Sarah Rowe. So as we do backgrounding on these individuals and with information we were receiving from the witnesses, some of whom knew at least parts of these offenders, we knew that they're sex workers. We knew that many of them were addicted to crack cocaine. And we also knew that some of them were violent, and they were violent against other sex workers. And that was information that we were getting.
I was covering the story for Global News, and once police left, the building manager let me and my photographer inside the apartment. It was chilling to be in the room where the alleged homicide had occurred. The following day, police got another tip.
Yeah, on May 24th, we had some people that had come forward to the police service, and they were cooperative with us, and they had indicated that they knew Sarah Rowe very well, and that while, again, this was a large story in our city, and while the media was on talking about a landfill search that was going on, that Sarah Rowe had indicated to them that she was involved in that file and that she was likely to go to jail.
In fact, one of those stories was mine. The news reports are believed to have sparked conversations between Sarah Rowe and some of her closest confidants.
As a result of that, they said, well, you need to go down to the police station and tell the police your side of the story. Sarah and these individuals started driving downtown to the police station to do that. And at some point while they were driving and stopped at an intersection, Sarah Rowe changed her mind and left the vehicle and ran away. Those individuals, though, still came forward and still told the police what they knew, what they had heard. We went looking for Sarah. And on May 25th, we arrested Sarah Rowe and brought her downtown so that we could interview her.
This was the first time a suspect in the case was questioned in relation to the possible homicide.
Obviously, we're interested in what Sarah's role was in this assault and possible murder. And we questioned her about her role. We questioned her about what she had been telling people. But Sarah says that, yes, she's cut people's hair off before as a punishment for being disrespected, but she did not assault anybody. She said that everything that's being spoken about was all rumor and innuendo, and she had nothing to do with anybody's murder.
Keep in mind, police still hadn't found or even identified a possible victim. And without that, or a confession, there wasn't enough evidence to charge Rowe with assault or murder.
So subsequent to the interview, Sarah was actually charged with possession of drugs and was ultimately released.
Investigators needed to figure out another way to get information about the alleged crime. Sean Gregson is the staff sergeant of one of the 2 Calgary police homicide teams now. But back in 2006, He was a constable with the Calgary Police Priority Crimes Unit.
We specialize in undercover work, a lot of covert assistance throughout the service. A lot of times, these are the things that the general public don't hear about, don't see, and we tend to like to keep it that way. A lot of resources go into these investigations. It could include wiretap authorizations, surveillance, many different things, and they all come together. Ultimately, we're trying to provide the truth and seek the truth for what occurred.
Police confirmed Sarah Rowe still lived at the White House with Alexis Vandenberg. Officers also learned there was another roommate, known as Crazy Chris, confirmed to be another sex worker named Crystal Struthers. Investigators decided Sarah Rowe would become the target of their undercover operation.
In this particular case, I was the file manager working with our undercover operators and as a liaison with our homicide unit. They'd received some information that they deemed to be credible, that somebody had been murdered. However, at this time, this would have been about May of 2006. There was no victim that had been located. They did have a first name or a possible first name of Rachel or Rochelle.
That's when Rowe met several new friends. Here again is Superintendent Cliff O'Brien.
Well, the goal of the undercover operators is always to find the truth. And so in this case, it's to find out, was Sarah in fact involved in this homicide? Were there others involved in a homicide? Was there even a homicide? And then who is the victim and where is the victim? Because although the landfill site is going on, it's possible that the victim's not even there.
The operation was risky.
When you're looking at undercover work, it is very dangerous. It's not only dangerous because you are trying to befriend a killer or a potential killer, it's also dangerous because of the activity that sometimes these people are involved in, also the people that they hang out with.
As you heard earlier, Staff Sergeant Gregson is pretty tight-lipped with undercover techniques. Needless to say, there were safety measures in place as they pushed forward.
So my job is to speak with the investigators, and they give me some information on what occurred at that time. And then I take that back and I don't release that information to my team, but I said, we have information that somebody's been murdered. We don't know who, and we think we know who was involved in this. So then we're gonna try to gain some information to help the investigators bring the information forward. If we can do that and obtain information or statements from our suspects at the time that'll be admissible in court, that's our main goal.
It didn't take long for the undercover officers to gain Sarah Rowe's trust. Superintendent O'Brien said that within a few days, she was confiding in her new friends.
She talks about not always having control over her anger and her temper. And at this time, while the undercover operation's going on, there's a fairly significant story in the media. It's not often that the police are at a landfill site looking for somebody, and we didn't have lots of information, and we certainly weren't releasing a lot, but it was in the media.
Police are going through missing persons files in an attempt to identify possible victims. The biggest challenge now, finding a body to see if this homicide investigation is truly a homicide.
We've had those challenges in the past. The report of a homicide certainly has to be supported by some real evidence to suggest that the homicide occurred. There have been cases in the past where we've been able to charge and convict persons responsible for homicides where bodies have never been recovered.
It was something that Sarah Rowe saw in the media, and she commented to the undercover operators that the police really didn't have very much. She felt fairly confident that the police were not going to find the victim, partially because of the way the victim was packaged, if you will, as she put it, and also because it's a landfill and it's just really a daunting task to find anything in a landfill.
Staff Sergeant Gregson said the undercover officers learned more about what happened to the mystery victim.
There was little pieces of information that were coming forward that seemed to corroborate the initial information and lend credibility to this, really what seemed like a crazy story.
Sarah Rowe became increasingly bold in her statements. Here's Superintendent O'Brien.
And one of the things Sarah Rowe had told the operators is that another person that was there by the name of Lexi had told Sarah that the victim was actually a police informant, that the victim had gone to the police and that resulted in somebody being arrested. And so they believe that she was an informant for the police. Sarah Rowe also disclosed that she had carved a word in the victim's forehead. She also talked about how the victim was a goof, and she made the victim write out some lines saying, "I'm a goof."
On June 8th, 2006, 2 weeks into the undercover operation and 6 weeks after the original tip was made to police, undercover officers pulled up to a convenience store just down the road from the White House. They met up with Sarah Rowe, who was beginning to worry about the amount of time police were spending at the landfill. She said she thought nobody would miss the victim and said she was a relatively unknown sex worker who she'd only met a couple of times. Rowe told undercover officers the woman had been looking for drugs. So Rowe, along with her friends Lexi and Chris, led her into the building. They invited her to their room to smoke crack. And then she disclosed chilling details of a homicide. And I need to warn you, she was very graphic in her descriptions. She said, quote, "I had her in blankets and saran wrap in a hockey bag. Like there was no part that wasn't saran wrap, sealed perfectly," end quote. Then she laughed as she described how she jumped on the body to get it to fit into the bag.
She doesn't confide with him everything she did and her role. Often what we find, even when we do undercover operations, is that people will say what puts them in the best light possible depending on the audience. And so she didn't confide everything that she did, but she did confide that she was concerned that she was going to go to jail for a murder.
As the conversation continued, Rowe told officers she was debating changing her hair color and was considering leaving the city. But by then, undercover officers had details they were previously unaware of, including how the body had been disposed of.
That wasn't anything that we had released publicly to anybody. She then talked about how she had taken the victim and she had put the victim in the BFI bin that was outside her apartment. And she had done that a week before we showed up. It's provided us enough information that we were now starting to realize that for sure Sarah had killed a victim.
Back at the dump, searchers had been battling sweltering heat for over a month, and they hadn't found a body. Staff Sergeant Gregson hoped details from Sarah Rowe would help.
So as this is going on, we're feeding the information back to the investigative team, and they're determining whether it's credible or not.
But time and resources were running out, leaving lead investigator Lee Dunbar and his partner frustrated.
We were desperate now. In a couple of days, this was going to be shut down.
Based on the latest information from undercover officers, they were more convinced than ever that this was not just a deadly rumor.
We had received some information from our undercover area that potentially she had been placed into a hockey bag.
Superintendent Cliff O'Brien was a part of those discussions, assessing all of the evidence gathered to date to try and determine if the search should end or continue.
The decision was made to continue and just go a few feet on either side of the area that had already been searched. We decided that what we would do is we would go 2 more bucketfuls. We had a large machinery, and we were just going to go 2 more bucketfuls all the way around the perimeter, just as a little bit of, I don't even know what we would call it. That's just what we decided, like, let's just try a little bit more. We've already invested well over a month into this. It was costing a significant amount of resources. Again, we had pulled patrol officers off of the street to do this very, very difficult work. And we thought we were already invested. Let's just try a little bit more.
Later that day, Constable Dunbar got the break he had hoped for.
It wasn't a couple hours later, he called me and said, "We got it. We've located her body." And I was in disbelief. So I went down there and yeah, absolutely. We had located her body in a black hockey bag.
It's been 5 weeks of searching through 500 metric tons of garbage, and finally police have found what they've been looking for. The homicide unit confirms they found a body, although it was found outside the original search area.
The Calgary Police Homicide Unit isn't saying too much about the discovery of the body just yet. Investigators are waiting for an autopsy to be completed.
The body's been exposed to the elements, the machinery, and as well as being extracted from the ground.
Police had hoped after they located a body, they would be able to identify the victim. But Superintendent O'Brien said in this case, it was extremely difficult.
We still didn't know a month later, even with locating the victim inside this hockey bag, we still didn't know who the victim was. And so one of the things that we turned our attention to is some forensics to try to identify who the victim was.
In 2006, Constable Jim Hands was an investigator with the CPS Forensic Crime Scenes Unit.
Given the passage of time, the conditions in which her remains were located, it was important that as much of her identifying marks, in this case friction ridge fingerprints, were preserved.
That wasn't an easy task. And to be honest, details of how Constable Hands managed to get fingerprints are too graphic to share. But after a lot of time and effort, he managed it. He also gathered other biological samples, including blood, and sent them to the RCMP lab in Winnipeg for testing.
Most people are fingerprinted at some point in their life, including police officers. And if the person we're trying to identify had fingerprints on file somewhere, they could be identified through the federal system. 2006 was very much in the CSI, what we termed the CSI effect. In other words, people were expecting things to be done like that, and that results would always be positive, which of course they weren't always positive. Sometimes people didn't get the results that they wanted. In this specific case, I think we submitted 2 or 3 different sets of exhibits for analysis.
Constable Hands was able to provide investigators with evidence that backed witness accounts of what happened to the victim. And again, these details are graphic.
Forensics is a part of the pie, of the puzzle. It's not all the pie or the puzzle. It corroborates other evidence, types of evidence. There is a belief that the victim had been possibly tortured, and in an attempt to corroborate what they believed, samples were taken from the victim's remains and processed through the crime labs. The final report indicated that there was indications of torture, including the remains of some cyanoacrylate or crazy glue on the victim's eyelids.
Forensic tests also revealed the victim was drugged with Seroquel. Here again is Superintendent Cliff O'Brien.
We knew that the victim had cocaine in her system, and she also had another drug in her system, which, although it's used for dealing with mental health issues, it sometimes is used to have people fall asleep, or people use it to try to fall asleep.
Sarah Rowe was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. I should note, at this point, the victim's identity was still not known. Her initial court document, the charge information, reads that Sarah Rowe, quote, on or about the 29th of April 2006, at or near Calgary, Alberta, did unlawfully cause the death of a female known only as Rochelle, thereby committing second-degree murder, end quote. That charge was later upgraded to first-degree murder. Superintendent O'Brien said her roommates, Alexis Vandenberg and Crystal Struthers, faced the same charges.
So we had all three of those women that had been identified as being potential offenders were identified and charged with the victim's murder. I think this one was horrific in that what you have is a victim that had not done anything wrong, that had been lured up to an apartment to smoke drugs, a victim that was a mother, a victim that obviously was addicted to drugs, but had done nothing wrong, a victim that was held against her will, a victim that was tortured, a victim that even when she cried out in pain, they're trying to crazy glue her mouth closed, a victim that had rat carved into her forehead, a victim that had an X-Acto knife that was used in other parts of her body to cause harm. She was tortured for the amount of time she was there. I can't imagine what her final hours were like.
Veteran defense lawyer Balfour Durr represented Struthers.
Because there was a confinement involved, and because the events took place over such a period of time, that planning and deliberation would have come into it. So they could have got to first-degree murder in probably a couple of different ways. This is one of my more memorable cases because of the horrific things that these three accused did to the deceased. They did things that, when I heard the description of it, I asked my client, where in the world did that come from? And the answer was something like, it just happened. And if you pardon my language, my answer was, because I was astounded, and I said, no, shit like that doesn't just happen.
The alleged motive was just as the original tipsters had suggested, that the offenders believed a rumor about the victim.
They were involved in some serious drugs. They were involved with some serious people. And how it all began was that the three who were accused believed that the fourth had ratted out their dealer. And that's what started this whole thing. And no doubt they were under the influence of intoxicants of maybe some or all types, but they believed that this fourth person, the deceased, was the one who was responsible for their dealer ending up in jail, being charged, and they were going to make amends for that.
Balfour Durr said, in the end, none of the three accused stood trial.
And that's where the plea bargain came in, simply because they were going to have issues proving the case, because there wasn't any one eyewitness who could identify who did what. And the prosecution needed to rely on the other accused to testify against my client. And I think that in the end, that's what motivated the prosecution to make a plea bargain with me on behalf of my client, where my client pled guilty to manslaughter and avoided a first-degree murder charge.
Struthers pleaded guilty first. She was given a 9.5-year prison term for manslaughter. In sentencing, the judge noted Struthers, quote, got the ball rolling, end quote, by identifying the victim as a rat, and noted she was present during the confinement and the acts of torture, and was the one who invited a fellow sex worker to have a go in the acts of torture. Struthers also admitted to helping dispose of the body. The judge also noted she held a moral sway over Alexis Vandenberg, which influenced her co-accused to stay and continue the acts of torture. Here again is her defense lawyer, Balfour Durr.
It's the degree of depravity in this case that sets it apart from, I'm having trouble thinking of the number of thousands of cases I've done, anything close to that. They somehow fueled themselves. They came up with ideas that Stephen King couldn't come up with in one of his horror stories. They just fed on each other. This business of crazy gluing her mouth shut and her eyes shut. I don't know who would come up with that. And to go out and buy X-Acto knives so they can carve the word rat in the deceased's head or carve up her back as they were standing over her. Like, you don't ordinarily see that level of violence come out, except in rare cases.
Alexis Vandenberg was the second accused to plead guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. She was sentenced to 9 years in prison. The judge found Vandenberg acted in concert with the co-accused in the unlawful confinement and degrading assaults of the victim, noting the attack was unprovoked. The victim's hands were tied, and the victim was not able to defend herself. And then, in November of 2008, 2.5 years after a rumor turned into an investigation, Sarah Rowe pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 12 years. The sentencing judge said the brutality of the murder, the indignities perpetrated on the victim's body, the victim's vulnerability, and that the victim was outnumbered were all considered aggravating factors against her. He found mitigating factors to be her remorse and her young age. At the time of the offense, she was 24 years old. Struthers was released from prison in 2012, 6 years after the violent torture and homicide. She was granted day parole. The board has shared insight into her background in various decisions over the years as she continued to progress to full parole. At the time of the offense, she had a $3,000 a day cocaine habit and was actively engaged in criminal activity and described herself as extremely violent. In one decision, they noted she would use a hammer to inflict fear in others living on the streets and to collect drug debts. Written decisions make note of her progress while in custody and credit institutional interventions, transitioning from full addiction, a life of criminality, and ultimately a leadership role in the death of another human being. She credited prison programming for her sobriety and her native spirituality and psychological counseling for amending her criminal attitudes and behaviors. The board also noted Struthers displayed meaningful empathy for her victims and remorse for her crime. Alexis Vandenberg's parole decisions reveal less success while in prison, though she has completed multiple programs, including dialectical behavioral therapy. She was not released on parole, but rather let out on statutory release in February of 2012, which marked 2/3 of her sentence and is mandated by law. The board said that in the following month, she went unlawfully at large for 2 weeks before she turned herself into police, and during that time used crack cocaine and engaged in sex work. Her statutory release was revoked in June of 2012. A psychological assessment dated February 25th of 2013 concluded that she has many of the characteristics of a person who is a high risk to reoffend violently. The board noted she has a history of emotional instability and continued to struggle with peer issues, and Vandenberg acknowledged the possibility of again becoming involved in violent crimes if she didn't seek treatment for deep-seated child trauma issues. Vandenberg remained in custody until her new statutory release date in the summer of 2013. Sarah Rowe was granted day parole in June of 2022, exactly 16 years after the body of her victim was discovered during the search of the landfill. A series of parole board decisions reveal she was physically abused as a child, though the board indicated Rowe didn't remember the abuse. It stated she became involved in drugs and violence from a young age and said Rowe has a history of being involved in unhealthy relationships. Her most recent risk assessment was in November of 2021, and she was assessed as a moderate risk to reoffend generally and violently. Though the board said because it's more than 2 years old, it's no longer considered valid. In granting her release, the board noted her apparent genuine remorse and successful programming that included work with a behavioral counselor to address emotional regulation and addressed her mental health needs. She also maintained institutional employment and provided animal care in the prison's kennel program. Rowe's day parole has been continued 3 times so far, and she's been noted as being compliant and stable. She will be on parole for the rest of her life. I'm sure by now you're wondering if the woman who was brutally tortured and killed in this case was ever identified. Thanks to the tireless work by forensic investigators in obtaining fingerprints from the victim, police were finally able to give her a name.
When we were finally able to identify the victim is a 35-year-old mom by the name of Rochelle Friars. It's sad when you think that somebody lost a life based on a rumor, based on what somebody thought, and in reality had nothing to do with the police, and somebody's making up stories about her, essentially. This was a complete waste. There's nothing to corroborate that the victim was a police informant.
According to court documents, Rochelle Friars was originally from Ontario, where she was a mother to 3 children. It's believed she hitchhiked to Calgary and ended up turning to sex work to support her addiction to drugs. In a victim impact statement, Rochelle's mother said the facts of the case destroyed her mind and said she would never be able to get over what happened to her daughter. She said it caused panic attacks and depression and stole her trust in people. The father of 2 of Rochelle's 3 children also wrote a statement describing her as a life partner and friend. He also described ongoing emotional, spiritual, and physical impacts on him and his family following Rochelle's murder.
Kudos goes out to the investigators and their tenacity. Otherwise, you'd have this mom of 3 children that would be murdered, and the family would never know what actually happened to her. So the fact that the investigators and everybody else involved in this file continued to work hard, even not knowing whether or not there was even a murder, but they continued to press and press and press. And as a result, they did exactly what we hoped to do, which is give answers to the family, albeit a sad ending and not the ending we want. We're at least able to give the victim a say and the victim's family information as to what happened.
Every time Staff Sergeant Lee Dunbar passes through the Beltline and the street where the White House used to sit, he thinks about the case that all started with a rumor. Had it not been for Dunbar and his partner's persistence and the support from their superiors to keep them on the case, this deadly crime could have easily gone unsolved.
It was bittersweet. There was just too much information there to not investigate, and it needed an answer either way.
Thank you to the officers who helped me share their work in uncovering the details of this case. And thank you for listening. Crime Beat is written and produced by me, Nancy Hixt, with senior producer Dila Velasquez. Audio editing and sound design is by Rob Johnston. Special thanks to photographer-editor Danny Lantella for his work on this episode. Thank you to Jesse Weisner, our Crime Beat production assistant. And thanks to Chris Bassett, the VP of Network Content Production and Distribution and Editorial Standards for Global News. I would love to have you tell a friend about this podcast. There are 6 seasons of stories you can listen to and share. And if you can please consider rating and reviewing Crime Beat on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can find me on Facebook at Nancy Hixt Crime Beat and on Instagram at nancy.hixt. Thanks again for listening. Please join me next time.